So it's 5:03, so I think we should start. As I see, most of the people today seem to be from the US, so good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I don't see many people from Taiwan so far, but if you're from somewhere on the other side, then good morning, of course. It's still a little early, although now, because of time change, not as early anymore. My name is Jens Reinke. I am the director of the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism here at University of the West. I warmly welcome you to our final Zoom event of this semester. And I'm especially excited to introduce Carolyn Chen, whose first book, Getting Saved in America, Taiwanese Immigration and Religious Experience, was formative for my own academic development. But today, of course, we are talking about her newest book, Work, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion in Silicon Valley. Carolyn Chen is Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley, co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and Executive Director of the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative, APARI. And of course, we are very grateful because APARI also finances one of our student research projects here on mapping Buddhism in the San Gabriel Valley. Then her research focuses on Asian American religion, as well as religion, spirituality, and work in contemporary America. Carolyn has published 3 books: Work, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion in Silicon Valley, Getting Saved in America, Taiwanese Immigration and Religious Experience, and Sustaining Faith Traditions, Religion, Race, and Ethnicity Among the Latino and Asian American Second Generation. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, CNN, and The Atlantic. And as usual, before we begin, some few words on the format of today's event. So Dr. Chen and I will have a conversation for roughly about 40 minutes, and then followed by questions from the audience. The questions from the audience are moderated by Angelica Barrera-Ng, who is somewhere here, there, the excellent research assistant of our institute. And so if you have any questions, please just raise your hand. There's like a raise hand function. If you can't find it, just really use your physical hand. And Angelica will unmute you. If you feel uncomfortable speaking, you can also always just type your questions in the chat room during the interview, and Angelica will read them for you. Okay, then welcome to ISHB, Carolyn. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having me here, Jens. And I really appreciate all of you showing up today. I know that it's busy finals week and there's a lot going on. So I really appreciate you all showing up.
Yeah, thank you. Let's just jump right into the conversation about your new book. So, of course, what is the, I just talked about your first book. Of course, in the list, the order wasn't chronological. Your first book was, of course, Getting Saved in America. Sustaining Faith Tradition came afterwards. So what is the relationship between those first books, who are much more closer on Taiwanese religion, and of course, the second generation, the second one? How is the relation to your new book, which seems to be a little bit, like a completely new topic?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jens. Thank you for it. Yeah, a lot of people feel like this is a completely different book, but in many ways there are similar themes between the two. And the one theme that I carry over in this new book is I look at tech workers as immigrants. This is one thing, in the popular discourse, we will often talk about tech workers as immigrants from India, say, or China, for Korea, for Germany, for instance. But really, the vast majority of tech workers are immigrants from within the United States. So they're coming from places like Kansas, from Georgia, from New York, from other places generally that are more religious than the Bay Area. And I'm really interested in, how does their religious experience change? How does their spirituality change? When do they come to the Bay Area? So that there's that similar that similar through line in me understanding how that transience migration affects religious experience. I'm also interested in how people practice religion in their everyday lives. So, and how they use religion to deal with the problems of meaning in their everyday lives. So, whether this is as a tech worker or as an immigrant from Taiwan who is adjusting to the United States for the first time.
Yeah, nice, interesting. So, but in the book, you claim that work has been replaced by religion in the Silicon Valley. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So let me go back a little bit to the first question and and then start to answer the second question at the same time. One of the things that I noticed in my first book, and this is, a story that this is a pattern that many scholars have talked about among immigrants in the United States, is that they often become more religious or differently religious after they move to the United States. And that's because faith communities, religious congregations are sources of, social resources, spiritual resources, ethnic resources, and they're all concentrated in the faith community. Well, one of the patterns that I discovered among tech, and I call them tech migrants, is that when tech workers would move to the Bay Area, they lost their religion. And they lost their religion, particularly when they started working in the tech, when they started working for a tech firm. So one of the people that I talk about in my book is someone that I call John Ashton. And he's an engineer who moved from Georgia to the Bay Area. And he was a very devout evangelical Christian. He grew up going to church. He was the president of his Christian fraternity in college, really involved. But when he started to work in the tech firm, in a startup, he lost his religion. Now, what was interesting here was that it wasn't just that he lost his religion. In fact, I argue that he converted to the religion of work. He took up a new religion. And so where his main identity in Georgia was that of a Christian, in Silicon Valley, it was his workplace. It was his tech company that provided his sense of identity. He identified with the name of the company. It is called Harmonize. So he and the other tech workers called themselves harmonizers. He got his sense of meaning and purpose and mission from the company as well. So it was no longer, to transform souls for God. It was rather to transform the world one user at a time. So he took on the company mission as his own personal mission. He even had this element of faith, because in Silicon Valley, only 1 out of 10 startups succeed. There was this element of faith, and really in all of my interviews, the mantra that I heard over and over again among tech workers is that you've got to drink the Kool-Aid, and there is this element where he kept on saying, you've got to believe that you're going to be the 1 out of 10 that's going to succeed. And he even used this Christian missionary language to describe the mission of the company. He told me, we just have this burden, using, again, that Christian missionary language of burden. We just have this burden that we have to change the world with our product. So what I saw here was that, yes, he lost his religion, but essentially work, the tech company, which I call the new faith community of the new economy, work replaced religion. Work became his source of identity, belonging, his community, his meaning, purpose, and even his sense of transcendence. Instead of, going to these Sunday services for inspiration, now it was the all hands meetings, the weekly all hands meetings at the workplace. And so understanding, how these secular institutions have really now fulfilled these very religious and social and spiritual functions that faith communities have. So my argument is that work is replacing religion, and in Silicon Valley. Now, I argue that this is part of while my book was a case study of Silicon Valley tech workers, I argue that this is a larger movement that we see among high-skilled workers, among professionals, and all other knowledge industry hubs in the US. So this is LA, this is Portland, this is Seattle, this is Washington, DC. And when I say that work is replacing religion, I mean, that professionals are looking to work to fulfill their needs for identity, belonging, meaning, and purpose, needs that they once turned to, social, spiritual needs that they once turned to faith communities to fulfill. And also that companies are using spiritual practices and spirituality and spiritual care to make their workers more productive. So for instance, they're offering meditation and mindfulness classes. They bring in spiritual and religious leaders to give inspiring talks to their workers. Most executive senior leaders are given executive coaches, which teach them often very spiritual practices to help them align the deepest parts of themselves to their work. One CEO founder that I interviewed called himself the head pastor of his startup. One executive that I interviewed told me that the workplace is the hotbed of spirituality in Silicon Valley. So, there's all this attention now to spiritual care and spiritual cultivation because this is making workers more productive.
No, I feel like language has an important role. I feel like as someone who's newly in the US, it's something that is really striking how businesses really use these kind of religious language, which I see less in Europe and in Taiwan, which are the places where I lived before.
Yes.
I'm also very familiar with Taiwan. But I wonder how is all this language of having having a mission itself is for me very unusual to hear that in a business context, right? So if you translate it word by word in European languages, other European languages, it wouldn't be. It's something that is connected to the church, of course, the Christian church. But I wonder how these Christian these religious language on the one side. What is the relationship between using these religious language, using all these imagery, and then providing these like wellness services for the workers who, as you say, seem to really focus on make them more productive, making them more efficient, right? So I kind of then secularized in a way, but at the same time there is this super religious discourse. So what do you think is the relationship between those two elements?
Yeah, so I'm trying to contextualize these shifts in the workplace with the larger transformations in our, in the political economy. And so, what I observe in this book, I argue that this is a reflection of this larger shift in our culture that is changes that have been a result of the rise of global capitalism, the kind of global competition that we see, also the rise of the knowledge economy. And what we've seen in the last 50 years is these changes in work, so that, we have this conventional and traditional way of talking about work as being extractive, right? Something that takes from us, something that's very demanding. But in my book, I argue that this is not a very useful way of talking about work, because we've seen this shift among high-skilled workers in the last 50 years, where work has actually become attractive. It has become a source of fulfillment. So what we see in the last 50 years, starting in the late 1970s, is that professionals have started to work more hours. So work has been taking more. It's been demanding more time and more energy and devotion than ever before, but it's also giving more in a way. It's giving people a sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment. And these are I think that we have to remember that, because we sort of take it for granted now, that people talk about work as being a source of passion, right? As a source of calling and a source of meaning. And I think that, Europeans don't use that kind of language quite as much, but I think it is creeping into the European way of also talking about work. But this isn't the way that people used to talk about work here either. And that we have to understand that this is also this kind of culture that's very much been cultivated by workplaces. So that, starting in the late 20th century, that in order to elicit the full effort and the full investment of the workers, companies really started to shift their own cultures. And so that the kind of metaphor of the company was no longer like a cog in a wheel or a machine, but rather to look more like a religious congregation, so that a workplace was supposed to provide meaning. It's supposed to provide belonging. There's this one quote from a well-known management guru who says, meaning is the new money. That this is what workers are really looking for. And here I want to just back up, and I want to map these trends onto the shift to a knowledge economy, to a post-industrial economy. In an industrial economy, the way that companies create profit is essentially by getting cheaper and cheaper sources of raw material and labor. So we've done that. We've outsourced our labor, right, to Vietnam, to China, to other spaces, to other sources, or you mechanize labor so that you don't have to pay, you just have a machine and you don't have to pay for labor anymore. The model of human labor is very different in a post-industrial economy, particularly in a knowledge economy. This concept of human capital, which we use so, it's so ubiquitous these days, but it's this idea that your human labor is your source of capital in your company. And in knowledge economies, you don't increase profit by getting cheaper sources of labor, because your most important, your most valuable asset is the knowledge that is embodied in your human workers. So the way that you increase profit is that you invest in and you develop your human capital. Well, there are different ways that you do this. You equip your workers with higher skills and more skills. So they learn a new programming language or technical skills, et cetera, right? They go for higher education, et cetera. But the other way that you do it is that you develop and grow their spirit. You develop and grow their spirit so that they align the deepest parts of their souls, their selves, with their work, so that there's no difference between their own identity and sense of calling and that of the work anymore. There's no difference at all. And so that you essentially grow their spirit so that their sense of calling becomes the calling of the workplace as well. That's why we see this shift and the importance and this emphasis now in companies on things like wellness and spirituality, because it's this interior cultivation and development that is so central and so key to knowledge workers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I just have a question because, of course, that's all very true, right? But there is one field where people accept religion that also was about production of knowledge and production of meaning. And that's, of course, education and academia, since we are all here in the field of education. But interestingly, these companies, they're not choosing the language and the imagery of liberal arts education or all these educational traditions, but they pick all these religious discourses, right? And religious words and images. So why do you think is that?
I think that it is because I think that it's so interesting. I think that if you look at some of the early literature from management literature in the late 20th century that's sort of sparking all this and starting all this, is that they really look to religion as an organization that can elicit the kind of faith and devotion. If you think about in our society, what are the institutions that really elicit the kind of faith, loyalty, and devotion that companies really want and require now in a post-industrial, in a knowledge economy? It's really faith communities. It's really religions. So now what they've done is they've imported and they've appropriated a lot of the language and affect and practices that we typically associate in the private sphere, in spaces like families and in faith communities, and they've now appropriated to the work environment. So words like not just mission, calling, passion, joy, even love, these are words that we I commonly heard all the time in the workplace. Practices like such as meditation and mindfulness, calling the workplace a family, right? Taking, when I talk to human resources professionals, I ask them, well, what is your job? Tell me what you do. They use this very maternal language, caring for employees, nurturing their souls, making sure that they're fulfilled, making the workplace this fulfilled space, all of these things which really we didn't normally associate with the workplace.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I'm just wondering also because in your book, of course, you talk about, mindfulness and all these like Buddhist derived practices, or as you write in your book, whitened Buddhist practices. But the language seems to be Christian derived, right? I mean, mission, calling, those are all Christian words. So how do you see then the relationship between those Christian and non-Christian or Buddhist influences playing out within this trend?
Yeah, so I think that the Christian terms are much more popular, like they're more kind of they've obviously become secularized, and they're more legible, say, just to the American population. I mean, you could use a word like dharma, but most people don't even know what dharma means, right? But here's the interesting thing, is that it's not, let me say this, is that I think that I argue that companies really operate like faith communities, like congregations. And just a bit of like geeky history is that many of the early founders, such as Robert Noyce, who's the founder of Intel, were folks who came from the Midwest from deeply, deeply Protestant backgrounds. His father was a congregational minister, and they have imported many of the sensibilities and the logic of Protestant congregationalism into the companies. And so I think that many of the companies, they don't see it, they don't know it, but it has many of the assumptions of, Protestant congregations. However, the actual spiritual practices that they use are very much they're very much inspired by Asian spiritual practices, in particular by Buddhism. And there's many reasons for that. One is simply the regional legacy of Buddhism and Asian spiritual practices in the Bay Area, where San Francisco being the epicenter of the counterculture and the beat movement, and spirit rock and all these insight meditation and all these other really important American Buddhist institutions. But I also think that this is a very secularized Buddhism that I argue in my book. One person that I interviewed who brings mindfulness into companies said it this way. She said, we steam clean the religion out of meditation, and so it's been able to gain this sort of, it's able to gain this legibility in the company because it's translated itself and it's made itself legible to the secular corporate workspace. And I argue in my book, I have this chapter called Killing the Buddha, where I talk about the different strategies and I call them meditation entrepreneurs, because what they're doing is they're taking a religious and spiritual practice, and they have to translate it, and they have to bring it into a secular space. And in the book, I ask, well, when a person moves from secular life to religious life, you have to renounce parts of the secular life, right? You have to renounce family, you shave your head, you now have a new community. Well, I argue that when religious practices move from the religious world to the secular world, they also have to renounce certain things. And one of the things that meditation entrepreneurs, meditation teachers, they were really, really fearful of meditation appearing religious. So, and most of them were bringing in really Buddhist meditation practices, right? I mean, many religious traditions have the practice of meditation, but they were really bringing in many of, like, specifically Buddhist practices. And they were really fearful that that the practices would be apprehended as religious. So there was this thing of where they would have to hide Buddhism. One person that I interviewed told me that she couldn't say what she called the B word in companies. And there's also this practice that I call whitened Buddhism, which, you know, we were talking about earlier, Jens, is this idea like there's this assumption that religion is divisive, it's particular, it's ethnic, it's something of a particular group of people. And embedded in this idea of secularism and what is secular is it's the idea that it is universal. It is something that can be practiced and shared among anyone, no matter what ethnicity, race, religion, whatever, you know, whatever particular background you might come from. But you have to understand that in the United States, when something is universal, it's racialized. There are some racial assumptions embedded in what is universal in the US. And that, of course, is whiteness. It is what is white is what is universal. It's ubiquitous. It doesn't smell. We can't see it. So there's this way that Buddhism and meditation had to become whitened in order to be able to kind of look like it was a secular practice in the tech company. And that required disassociating it from the religious Buddhism of Asians and Asian Americans. And this is something that, for instance, the scholar Sharon Sa and Joe Shea have also written about as well in their work. So what's interesting is that what gets imported into the tech company is not the absence of any religious practice, but only those religious practices that are no longer deemed as religious, right? So something like, wearing prayer beads or having a rosary. Well, now that might be seen as sort of like a fashion accessory. So that's not associated with being religious anymore. Or maybe saying putting your hands in prayer, like to say thank you. That's no longer associated as being religious anymore because it's universal. But using incense, no, not everyone does that, you know. So it's really interesting, like what gets chosen. And I argue that particularly in the Bay Area, there is this ambient Buddhism that kind of trickles down, and this is again part of the legacy of the counterculture. But that what's happened in the Bay Area is that that many of the youth and the countercultural youth who participated in these movements in the 1960s and 70s, well, you know what, they're now mainstream and they're actually leaders, they're senior leaders, they're actually powerful folks in the Bay Area now. So this is like Mark Benioff, the late Steve Jobs, you know, Jerry Brown, you know, the governor. So that they've made the kind of countercultural Buddhism, what was at one time countercultural in the 60s and 70s is now quite mainstream. And I call it, you know, this sort of trickle down Buddhism that comes from the elites is now just just part of the ambient culture. I also discuss how meditation providers need to scientize and legitimate meditation practice with, you know, legitimizing it with all these scientific studies. They need to also, another strategy is bottom line Buddhism. They need to prove that Buddhism is profitable and that, so now that, sorry, not Buddhism, but meditation is profitable. So meditation is no longer a spiritual practice. Rather, meditation has become a productivity practice to optimize one's performance, to increase one's mental, you know, one's cognitive functioning. Finally, I argue that meditation providers, they need to make meditation efficient. And so that it needs to conform to the logic and the time of corporate time. So that, people would tell me, oh, I first started teaching meditation in the company 1 hour once a week. And then all the managers started to complain. So I reduced it to half an hour once a week. And then after that, they still started to complain. So now, they just got rid of me altogether. And now they have Headspace as an app. And on the Headspace app, you get to choose, I want to meditate for 1 minute or for 5 minutes or for 20 minutes, right? And it has this, so what happens is that meditation starts to take on the instrumental logic of capitalism and of the workplace, so that you also get to choose on your app, of course, what function you want your meditation to meet. Is it to relax? Is it to focus better? Is it to feel more calm? You get to choose who your trainer is, by their age, their sex, their gender, all of these things, right? Which completely instrumentalizes the practice of meditation. And it also individualizes it, right? It is no longer me submitting to a larger tradition, to a larger community, the way that one would practice, in a Sangha or in a Zendo. It's now becomes this relationship of a user to a tool, essentially, right? And I forgot to mention the other function of these apps is they track how well you are meditating and if you're improving. So here's a practice that ultimately is not about achieving anything, right? It's about, and now it's inserting it with this very kind of logic and this impetus and this impulse for achievement about performance and about achievement. So it's completely, transformed the practice.
Oh, well, that makes me wonder. We are already moving almost out of time, but I have so many questions. Well, the main thing that makes me wonder, what kind of people do these companies normally hire as meditation instructors? Because I would assume the majority it is European Americans, and of course the Buddhism taught by European Americans is already quite secularized and sanitized, and they kind of moved away from its Asian roots, in ignoring all these processes of modernization that had happened, of course, in all these, in Taiwan, in China, in Thailand, and all these countries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the people who teach meditation in these companies really run the gamut. Some of the people that I interviewed were Buddhist priests. They were Zen priests. Others were Dharma teachers. Others were did not identify as Buddhist at all, but really, I mean, as you know, there's very little credentialing, right, when it comes to meditation. So it could have been like a wellness instructor who taught Pilates and then got a certificate in meditation. So it could really, really run the gamut. There wasn't any one particular person. But one of the things that I noticed here, and I think this is a really important part of the story, is that very few of the people, except for, I don't know if you know Meng Tan, who wrote Search Inside Yourself. He was a former Google employee. Except for him, I think no one was like, I just want to make tech workers more productive. This is my life calling, is to make, no one, the tech workplace was not the place that people really, this is not where they necessarily wanted to teach, but rather it was out of financial necessity. This is because they live in the Bay Area, and really because of tech, the cost of living has really increased and has risen. And so that in order to make a living, these folks who might have been teaching in retreat centers, and who also did teach in retreat centers, right, or meditation centers, or community centers, or in prisons, or in schools, they had to find a way to make a living. So for them, it was all like one by one, they started turning to teaching meditation in tech companies. And so they had to find ways to monetize the teaching. In order to do so, they really had to transform it, right? They had to find ways to make it legible in a tech company. And people had very, mixed feelings about that. I think that, I in no way want to, I saw people struggling with that. Most of the people who taught meditation in the workplace, they were very spiritual people. They were practitioners who really saw it as a spiritual practice, but because of the economic situation, had to monetize it.
Oh, well, thank you. One last question before we go to the audience. And of course, I want to know, using my privilege as a moderator here, what are you working on right now? I mean, what's your next big project?
Oh, gosh. So
maybe it's too early. I don't want to give you any pressure, but since I have the chance to ask you, of course, I have to ask you.
yeah, so so I'm really coming out from this book, I was really interested in so what one of my critiques in this book is that the worship of work, which I argue is in the religion of work, which I see in Silicon Valley, and I think is a harbinger for things to come in all these other knowledge industry hubs, is impoverishing our social fabric, is tearing away our social fabric and impoverishing our public. And our spaces for community, for belonging, for finding meaning and purpose outside of the workplace. And so I'm really interested in my next project in looking at how spaces and logics that are outside of capitalism, outside of work. So these are religious traditions, these might be ethnic traditions or cultural traditions, provide spaces and logics and traditions and practices for community outside of the workplace. And I think that this is a particularly important, again, in these knowledge industry hubs, where we see, which I call like hyper-stratified cities, places where you have super rich and super poor. And this disinvestment from the public. We don't have these spaces anymore where people from different walks of life can come together. And I think that this is a problem for our public sphere. It's a problem for our democracy. This is leading, I think, to the polarization that we see in so much of America.
Oh, thank you so much. We're already over time. Again, everybody buy her book. It's a great book. Maybe there's already like a paper copy out there.
Oh, no paperback version yet, but hopefully.
Okay, so still the hard copy.
But hopefully soon.
Yeah, hopefully soon. So thanks again to Carolyn, Chen. Thanks again to all the audience for attending our last event this year. I hope you all have a very restful and relaxing holiday break. As usual, I want to express my gratitude to the University of the West. We have Dr. Jane Iwamura here, to Fo Guangshan, to Xilai Temple, and of course to Angelica. I wish you all a great evening, a great day, wherever you are, and see you next semester. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.